unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. The third phase of India's 44-day-long polls took place today with voting held in 94 constituencies across 12 states. So far, the elections have been marked by lower-than-expected turnout, intensifying communal rhetoric, and a sharp debate about inequality and redistribution. Against this backdrop, the New York Times Magazine recently published an essay by the journalist Samanth Subramanian titled "Time is Running Out for Rahul Gandhi's Vision for India." The piece was based on a reporting trip in February and March of this year in which Samanth traveled Uttar Pradesh with Rahul Gandhi, the de facto leader of the Congress Party. The profile examines how Gandhi is approaching what could be the biggest political test of his life. To talk more about his recent essay, Samanth joins me from his home in London. He is the author of several books, including This Divided Island, Life, Death, and the Sri Lankan War, and a dominant character, The Radical Science and Restless Politics of J.B.S. Haldane, which was a New York Times notable book of 2020. He has long reported on India and Indian politics, and it's a pleasure to welcome him back to the show for the second time. Samanth, it's wonderful to see you.
Good to see you too. I feel like this is the only time we talk is when we're on your podcast.
Yes, so we must remedy that, but I do want to ask you about this very interesting profile that you've written, and of course we will link to this in our show notes so all of our listeners can read it for themselves. You, over the years that we've known each other, obviously have done a lot of political reporting based out of India. But in recent years, as I said at the top, you've been living in London, working on a huge range of things, some of which relate to India and many of which don't. What made you return to India to follow Rahul Gandhi on the second leg of this kind of, pretty significant cross-country yatra?
Well, initially, this all started about a year ago, when the Times came to me and asked if I was willing to do a profile of Rahul Gandhi. And my initial answer was no, because I was pretty sure, and I turned out to be right, but I was pretty sure that I would get no access to him. And I continue to feel that some of these profiles of politicians written without access, without interviews, they really end up sort of reheating the same kind of meal everybody's been eating for a while now. And I made these attempts at the time to contact Rahul's team. I talked to his advisors and I asked if an interview would be possible. They put it off until the fall of last year, until about September, at which point they gave me a really conclusive answer. They said there would be no interviews at all. And so I went back to the Times and I said, listen, I'm not interested in doing this piece because it would just be meaningless. It would be shallow. But then in December or January of this year, it emerged that he would be doing this second yatra. And as a writer, you're always trying to find more than fresh material. You're also trying to find a narrative framework on which to hang your story. And a yatra is a perfect example of that. I mean, it provides color and landscape and characters. It offers a kind of chronological sweep to a story. And the more I learned about this leg of the yatra, especially about the Uttar Pradesh part, the more I started to realize that this would be a great way to access the Rahul story, even without interviewing him. Uttar Pradesh is, as I say in the story, Uttar Pradesh is a land that he once described as his karma bhumi. This is the land where he was fated to work. This is the land where his family has come from. His family's pocket boroughs are in this state. And it is also the state that the family and the Congress have lost over the decades. And so to access the Rahul Gandhi story by traveling with the yatra through Uttar Pradesh suddenly seemed to me sort of full of possibilities to tell a story. And so at that point, we decided we'd get on the yatra. We organized it, which was actually the Congress is extremely good with responding to the media in many other aspects. So the logistics of how to join the yatra and how to coordinate with people on the road, all of those are extremely good. And so I was there, I think in mid-February, and we started in Varanasi. And I went through 6 towns or 7 towns, ending in Kanpur. and then flew back out.
And just on the access issue, I mean, it sounds like they kind of pretty conclusively told you the answer before. But as you said, the fact of this yatra made it somewhat more appealing or interesting to you. Was there a part of you which thought maybe once you show up on the ground that he and his people might change their mind?
There was. And frankly, they didn't shut the door the whole way about the possibility of talking to him on the yatra. One of the people in the communication cell, I remember saying, well, we might be able to find some time. There's always, a few minutes here and there at the camp. And apparently this was what had happened on the first yatra, the first one, which was in 2022, offered plenty of opportunities for journalists to talk to him on the sidelines, walking with him, all of that stuff. So I did kind of hold out some slim hope until the very last day. And then at that point, it became quite clear that he wasn't willing to talk to any media, not just me.
And, I don't want to put you in a position of having to speculate his intentions, but does this surprise you? It surprises me because it sounds like here's somebody who he and his party are clearly the underdog by any metric this race. Speaking to an outlet like the New York Times, to a reporter like you who's known and has a long track record, I mean, it kind of seems like a no-brainer. Were you puzzled? I mean, how did you interpret this?
I mean, there's so many angles here, and this in itself is sort of makes for interesting political discussion. The first is that increasingly a culture has grown in India and in many other parts of the world, where a politician doesn't really feel the need or the obligation to sit down with journalists and to do an interview. We know this, of course, from the shining example of India's prime minister right now, but more than anything else, we see it in many other parts of the world as well. And it's not just politicians, it's public figures of every stripe. Indian cricketers haven't given, extended interviews or profiles to journalists for ages. Indian film stars stopped offering that kind of access as well. One reason is that they're extremely wary of the press and the media. The second reason is that they have their own media channels now. I mean, Rahul doesn't need the New York Times or anybody to get his message out there when he has a YouTube channel and Instagram and Twitter and all of this other stuff. But I think beyond that also, perhaps sensibly, the Congress and Rahul have seen that their constituency isn't really the New York Times readership. You and I might like to think that the New York Times is the most powerful media organization in the world, and to be featured in its pages is a huge coup for any politician. But this is Rahul Gandhi. I mean, this is a guy who cannot go anywhere in a country of 1.4 billion people and not be recognized. The readers who are on the Upper West Side don't really matter to him that much when he has a YouTube channel that is tailored to his exact needs, on which he can curate the message that goes out. And I think this is, it's something that is... I say it's perverse only because this goes against my own interests as a journalist. But I think there's a certain kind of independence of spirit about it that I kind of admire, that a politician is willing to say no to the New York Times and to sort of go ahead and just talk to the people he wants to talk to. Not that he's talking to anybody. There are no interviews being given at all. But this is a kind of strategy that is not just restricted to politics anymore. And in some ways, it kind of even perhaps symbolizes the waning strength of the media itself. So
I want to just, ask you a little bit about your experience on the yatra and interacting with people, around Rahul Gandhi. Just a kind of question before we do that about the origins. I mean, we had an episode a couple months ago with Dipankar Ghosh of the Hindustan Times, who tracked some of the original Bharat Jodo Yatra in the Hindi heartland. This was its successor, as you mentioned, the kind of second leg, which was the Bharat Jodo Nyay Yatra. What was the logic here? I mean, in interviews, and it comes across in your profile as well, that Rahul Gandhi's kind of said explicitly, this isn't kind of an electoral logic here. This is something else at work. It's about the grassroots. It's about social mobilization. I mean, could you tell what the central objective of this exercise was?
Well, I think so back in the pandemic, I think after the 2019 defeat, Rahul and the Congress were both under intense pressure, essentially to figure out some kind of way to mobilize Indian people, Indian citizens, to offer some other kind of narrative to counter the ideology of the BJP. And they weren't finding it at a sort of top-down central level. It was just really impossible to craft anything that could that offered any serious weight to the BJP's ideology. And so the story I heard was that in 2020, he was in lockdown in his house in Tughlaq Lane. He was walking 40,000 steps a day, essentially trying to prepare for this yatra, which he had conceived of even back then. And, let's be clear. I mean, the yatra is not an entirely original or novel concept. It's been used many times in Indian political history. But I think Rahul also saw this as something that he was particularly good at, which is to talk to people one-on-one, to kind of, to shy away from these big rallies and these big speeches, which he's not very good at. Somebody mentioned to me on the rally that he's best at the Socratic sort of mode of conversation. He doesn't really do well on stages. And I think he saw this as an asset, and I think he really genuinely thought maybe there was something to be gained from going out there and listening to people. And to be completely fair to him, even his worst critics say that the first yatra was something of a success. There was some kind of energy that people felt on the yatra. I heard so many stories of people who accompanied him on yatra kind of finding this connection that the Congress party as an institution still somehow shares with people on the ground, particularly outside the Hindi heartland. This was in the south and in the north and the west and in the east, not necessarily in Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh so much. And I think that kind of energized him in 2022. It energized the party. I heard plenty of people from opposition parties say that that was the first time they really thought of Rahul as a politician, that he had kind of discovered, he'd to quote from another profile of Rahul Gandhi that ran recently, he had earned what he had inherited. And so I think when it came time to think about what to do next, particularly as an election came close, I mean, for Rahul, it seems as if the answer was obvious, that you do something that you've done before that you were good at. And so he organized this other yatra. Now, this is the yatra that I think divided the Congress a little bit internally, because they felt, they felt that as the election drew closer, what you really needed was a much more bread and butter political campaign. You needed strategy. You didn't need to sort of be in a car traveling through from east to west, not really addressing rallies, but also not really meeting people because you were in a motorcade for the most part. And I think the fact that he was distant from the Congress headquarters at a time when he needed to be in Delhi, forging alliances, all of this other, good, solid political stuff, that kind of divided views in the Congress back in January and February. But I think from Rahul's point of view, it was something it's almost as if this is the only part of politics that he feels he's good at and that maybe he enjoys. But more importantly, and we can talk about this later, this is what he feels his role has to be in the party going forward.
Well, I just want to wanted to ask you about this later, but now seems like an appropriate time to ask you about the timing, because again, in that previous conversation I had with Deepankar, he said that within the Congress, there was a feeling that Rahul was doing the yatra when he should be campaigning, and he was campaigning when he should have been doing the yatra. So there was this kind of conflation. And what's interesting is in your piece, you mentioned a kind of similar exchange which you had with the kind of veteran, kind of old guard Congress leader Salman Khurshid. It does seem a little bit strange that, you have this massive general election on, that you would be so distant from Delhi. Did that create actual problems? I mean, did you find sort of evidence that people were saying, this is actually obstructing or impeding or hindering somehow the procedures of the campaign?
I think it did. I mean, obviously, this is what I hear from people in the Congress party is that they would have liked to have him closer at hand in Delhi during those crucial months, because that's when you form alliances. That's when you decide who's fighting from which seat. But also, I feel like because of the constraints of time, this wasn't the kind of yatra Rahul would have envisioned anyway. I mean, he's on a car for most of the day. He stops in certain towns and he delivers speeches, and he both is bad at that and doesn't enjoy it. The speeches are 14 or 15 minutes. They're not hugely inspired. And then he goes off to the next, or he went off to the next venue. The fact that the sort of the demands of electoral politics of the campaign itself intruded so much is, let me give you one example. The first day of our yatra, we set off with great fanfare. We left Varanasi. We saw a speech of his in Varanasi, and then we followed him a little bit further out. There was this break for lunch. And then we got back into the media van, and we were hoping to accompany the campaign to the next town. And then all of a sudden we hear Rahul is leaving. He's cutting the day short. He's going back to Varanasi and then flying to Wayanad, his constituency in Kerala, to deal with some kind of local issue that's come up there where he needs to be present as a member of parliament. So we had nothing to do. We went back to our hotels and we just spent half a day sort of sitting around until we joined the campaign again the next day, or the yatra again the next day. So and he did this often. I mean, there were many days in which he had to sort of shoot off for half a day or for a few hours to attend to party business, and then to come back to the yatra to drive on to the next city. I mean, it was a very fractured stop-start affair. And so I feel like it was a kind of unsatisfying thing where nobody was satisfied. The Congress wasn't satisfied. Rahul himself probably wasn't very happy with how it went. The crowds didn't seem to really understand what this was all about. So, and yet, I mean, I just kind of think back to the 2022 yatra and everything I heard about that. I envision probably that as the platonic ideal of the thing that Rahul wants to do more than anything.
You mentioned a couple of times already his uninspired, or just kind of, the way in which the crowds don't necessarily lap up what he's saying. In your piece, you described him as a fidgety orator who has trouble kind of shrugging off the kind of disturbances and annoyances of a rally. You say that he didn't exactly ramble, but he eddied around the point he wanted to make, right? How is the crowd reacting when he's up there giving this 14 or 15 minute speech? I mean, as you're observing people around, I mean, is it sort of people who are a bit confused? Are they just bored? I mean, how would you describe the kind of dominant sentiment amongst the people who have shown up?
Well, I think a lot of people showed up, first of all, because Rahul Gandhi is still Rahul Gandhi. I mean,
right. He's a celebrity above all.
He's a celebrity. He's the fourth generation or fifth generation of a political family. He has all this sort of rich and sometimes traumatic political history behind him. And so people came out of curiosity, and I would have come too if I was, living in a town that he was passing through. You mentioned sort of the fidgetiness of him as an orator. One of the things that struck me is that he kept, at the beginning of his speeches, he would call for silence. This is like like fighting against a tide in an Indian political rally. If you expect people to be silent in a crowd, he was very schoolmasterly almost in that way, and very petulant when he didn't get the silence that he wanted. And then he would he would jump from topic to topic. People were sometimes confused about why he was saying certain things in certain places. The fact that he didn't stick to a particular topic. He wasn't able to, he would always, in every speech, he would hit on one or two notes that resonated with the crowd. Caste is a big one. In Uttar Pradesh, one of the other ones was just sort of how broken the entrance exam system to the public services are, and how frustrated young men and women are with that process. He would always hit on these notes, but I kept thinking that a seasoned politician, or a born politician, would ride the enthusiasm in those resonant moments and ride them until he could ride them no more. But he would switch immediately. He would it's as if he had a template in his mind, a lesson plan, if you will, and he was just completely unwilling to deviate from it, no matter what the public sentiment was. And then at the end of every speech, the motorcade would zoom on, and I would kind of hang around to talk to people who were still there. And this is what they would say. They would say, his charisma as a public speaker it paled in comparison to Modi. He said some interesting things. We wish he would say more about this. It was all sort of very lukewarm, and I couldn't help feeling that a more powerful politician or more powerful speaker would actually have made a lot more of these crowds that came to see him.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. Probably the money quote in your piece is this amazing line from Sitaram Yechuri, who is the General Secretary of the Communist Party of India, Marxist, CPIM, long time left leader, where he tells you that, look, Rahul doesn't say it, but he's modeling himself after Mahatma Gandhi. He doesn't actually want any official position of power. And so I guess my question to you is, well, what role does he envision for himself, right? Because in the event that his party is able, either in this election or some other election, to actually reclaim national power, what would he be doing?
I mean, it's an interesting question. And one of the things to remember here is that the Gandhi before him also declined any position of power. I mean, his mother could have become prime minister twice if she wanted, and she declined both times. So there's an immediate sort of precedent at hand for him to say, well, look, there's a backroom role and there's a role in government, and maybe this is the one that I and my family should choose. But beyond that, I think what has happened, and this is the crux of my piece really, is that over the last 10 or 15 or 20 years that Rahul has been active in electoral politics and active in the Congress party, he's essentially been frustrated so much by his attempts, first, to reform the party from the inside, and second, over the last 10 years, to guide it to power, that there might be sort of an element or a measure of self-realization here, which is that he's just not cut out for that kind of political work. Maybe he doesn't enjoy it. Maybe it's too complex and he doesn't have the stomach to engage in the kind of fights that you need to engage in if, for example, you want to push some of the old guard out, or you want to if you want to implement a primary voting system within the party. I mean, all of these things he's been trying to do and he's failed to do. Maybe a certain kind of disillusionment has set in. But at the same time, he doesn't want to turn his back on the party and on politics itself. And so what he kind of sees as a role for himself now is to spread only the ideology, is to be the ideology of the Congress without really riding that into a position of power. So which is why he brings up, or which is why Sitaram brought up Mahatma Gandhi, I think, because that's the kind of relationship between the Congress and himself that Rahul envisions. He is kind of off the party, but outside it. He is working at a kind of grassroots civil society level. He doesn't really take positions of power in government. He doesn't even really, maybe he doesn't want to even be in electoral politics at all. But and maybe we can kind of debate this. I mean, I'm curious to hear what your views are on somebody like Rahul taking a position like this. I mean, the Mahatma is a singular figure in Indian history. And I mean, quite apart from sort of the hubris of saying, maybe I'll fashion myself after the Mahatma, there is also this, I think Rahul mistakes the Mahatma's role as an apolitical role. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, if anything, if we've learned anything from Ram Guha's books, for example, about Gandhi, is that he was an extremely canny political operator, that he made the Congress do what he wanted them to do. Even though he professed a kind of arm's length distance from the party, he was extremely involved in its day-to-day affairs, or week-to-week or month-to-month affairs. And Rahul, I think, sees himself as above politics, and that's not what the Mahatma was at all.
Well, so here's my view of it, which is that, and this really, frankly, shone through in your profile, which is that, we have this phrase, right, in English where you say you can't be half pregnant, right? You can't be half in and half out. You have to be one or the other. He's no longer the Congress Party president, but as you say, is undoubtedly its face. Like, to the extent that you can point to someone and say, well, this might be the opposition chief minister if the BJP were to be surprised with an electoral defeat. I think Rahul would be, of course, the most obvious choice. But this in-between thing, I think, has created a big problem because, one of the major knocks on the party is that it's this kind of nepotistic, dynastic, kind of ancien regime. And they sort of took a half step towards addressing this by saying, okay, you know what? We are not going to have somebody with the last name of Gandhi as the titular president. We now have Mallikarjun Kharge, right? There was an election. It was not a particularly fair election, but there was an election. But everybody knows that Kharge, yes, I mean, he may be doing the kind of day-to-day organizational work, but Gandhi is still the one who's out front, right? And in fact, what the yatra does is only make him more in front. So it seems like, you've taken the step that actually could unburden you with this tag of being this kind of out of date, a family-based party, but then inserted yourself back into it in a way that you're kind of neither here or there. And that's kind of my takeaway, right? And I think ultimately, we've now had sort of two cycles where he has been the person atop. He's been both running the organization in a way, I mean, along with his mother and other people, and he's also sort of been the face. And now he's only the latter. But I think all expectations are that the results will be the same, if not worse.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so then that kind of sort of raises the question, well, what happens next? I mean, in the event that the Congress loses this election, they've kind of tried, in a sense, they've tried everything with Rahul. They've had Rahul as the head of the party, as the titular president, and they lost in 2019. They've had this new avatar of him where there's another president and Rahul is out there spreading the good word. And if they lose this time as well, I mean, what else is left for Rahul and the Congress to try? And the answer is, I mean, Rahul's answer to this, I think, is that he'll just keep doing what he's doing now. He doesn't, I end my piece by saying that I don't think, from everything I hear, I don't think he's in a hurry, which is something that a man in his early 50s can afford to say when he's facing off against a politician in his 70s. But there are extremely urgent, on-ground, pressing reasons as to why India needs a robust opposition party in a hurry. And so there's a tension there that I don't know how that will be resolved. I mean, it's impossible for anybody. Somebody told me this. Somebody told me that when the Congress lost in 2014, Rahul said to close colleagues within the party, we won't come back in 2019, but we'll come back in 2024. He had already, at that point in his mind, as far as I can gauge this, skipped an entire sort of election, thinking that that's the kind of disarray that the party was in. Well, it's 2024 now. And, there's been plenty of sort of damage and a real impact that this BJP government has made in the last 10 years, which has made it harder for the Congress to come back to power. So the question is, I mean, if Rahul is willing to wait for as long as he thinks is necessary, is there even going to be a Congress left to revive at the end of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there is a distinction you make in the piece. You mentioned it kind of just a little bit ago where you said, look, Rahul looks at the BJP as a kind of political come ideological machine, right? His view is that you can't defeat it only with a political machine. That and my sense from reading your piece is what he believes he is doing is helping to rebuild, resuscitate, redefine the kind of ideological machine or the kind of social machine alongside what is the formal kind of party building that's taking place, right?
And I do think that's a valid line. I mean, I think, we've all commented upon this, is that the BJP's appeal is almost sort of cultural. There's a kind of cultural aspect to this entire thing, in which its ideology is seated, that has appealed to people beyond just sort of the transactional aspects of electoral politics. So I don't think he's wrong there. I just think that maybe he and the Congress have struggled to put together a counter ideology that can be taken into the BJP's camp. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, the thing is also, we have no idea how any of this will play. I mean, there might be anti-incumbency, there might be some kind of like visceral bond that the Congress and abstract notions like love and brotherhood still, they might still have some currency in elections. It's a combination of everything, maybe, who knows? But I do think that this is what he sees his own role as here, as kind of articulating the culture, the ideology, the morality and ethics of what he thinks the Congress stands for.
Let me ask you about this love and brotherhood point, because that's actually where the piece ends off. You say that, Rahul wants to persuade people to consider lofty things like morality and love indispensable values that nonetheless make for nebulous campaign platforms. That's a quote from your piece. When he talks in places like Varanasi, Kanpur, every place in between, about replacing a so-called market of hate with a shop of love, how do ordinary voters in the heartland respond to that?
The problem, I think, is that he doesn't. This might be a strange thing to say, but I'm going to say it and then I'll explain. The problem is he doesn't talk about it enough, by which I mean he will say, a few sentences around these subjects, but then he will move on to other things without quite explaining what this the shop of love will look like as a social project, how it will be implemented, how people will get over these kind of frictions and animosities that the BJP has stoked, without thinking that they're losing something in the bargain. I think that's sort of the main problem here, which is that he's kind of I have no doubt that he's sincere about this. Somebody that both you and I know told me that Rahul is almost a purist when it comes to the people around him, in terms of secularism, in terms of an anti-RSS stance. He's very sincere about the fact that religion shouldn't matter and that people should be one in the eyes of the Indian state. But having said that, he somehow hasn't figured out a deeper, broader message and framework with which to put this across. So it remains a slogan painted on a wall, in essence. And so for that reason, people don't really respond to it because there's nothing to respond to beyond the slogan. I do genuinely think that there is a kind of population out there in India that wants to respond to things like that. And I did see it. You would talk to people and even in UP, even in the heartland of the BJP, there is a strong, still robust kind of current of just ordinary humanity. And so there are people out there who want to respond to it. They just don't know sort of what to respond to beyond that one slogan.
Well, so the example that I use, and maybe it's a bad one, and I'm not trying to say that, this is going to be something that's going to be make for a real, barnstorming kind of campaign rally. But, just kind of think about the redefinition of secularism, right? What do we know? We know that the way in which secularism was practiced clearly has failed. And it's been very easy for the BJP to tarnish it as minorities appeasement, as pseudo-secularism. And so there has to be reimagination done. Take an issue like the Uniform Civil Code, right, which is an interesting issue because it's not just something that has been on every BJP manifesto going back in time. It's actually a lot of liberals I mean, you mentioned Ram Guha earlier. Ram Guha has talked about the need after 75 years for a uniform civil code. The question really is, what is the content of such a code, right? How do you fashion one that takes the best from India's kind of, multi-ethnic, multi-faith kind of polyglot while kind of minimizing the most illiberal forms? That's an idea, but it's also a very intricate and complicated legislative and political project. I mean, part of the reason the BJP hasn't done this already is because, it's quite hard. What I foresee happening, right, politically, is at some point, maybe after 2024, the BJP will put together their ideal UCC, and it will be one that is very much peppered with Hindu characteristics, which will have a BJP spin on it, and be able to sell this as, like, this is actually the answer that liberals have been waiting for. And Rahul and the Congress have essentially ceded that space where they could have spent their 10 years in the wilderness actually thinking kind of as a game theory theorist would, okay, this is what they're going to do, so what can we do before, and kind of minimize, their responses. And my own sense, and again, just talking to people in the Congress Party who have been working on campaigns, is that's really not where they are intellectually or organizationally.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't know what prevents them from going there, because there's no doubt that they can call upon policymakers, framers of policy, to think through these things. But there's a certain kind of restraint or maybe timidity that prevents them from being as bold as that, is to basically sort of take one of the BJP's core manifesto promises and make it their own. And part of this, I think, lies in the fact that for the longest time and until today, the Congress continues to see Indian Muslims as one of its core vote banks, and and maybe they think that the refashioning of this idea of the uniform civil code in a way that doesn't jeopardize the Muslim community and its practices and its ideas and its values is too great a challenge, that in trying to do that, they will lose the one vote bank that they think they still have. So maybe there's some of that playing into it as well. And so, to be fair to the Congress also, they get pilloried from every side, right? I mean, any attempt to kind of pursue a certain policy that is widely seen to be broadly pro-majoritarian. It doesn't even have to be the case, but anything that is widely perceived as pro-majoritarian gets them a ton of flack. And the Uniform Civil Code, again, is a perfect example. I mean, if they set about trying to sort of take this from the BJP manifesto and rebuild it, they will get flack from people they think that are on their side. The left, for example, will be a huge critic of this particular move. So they're in a weird situation. And that is part of the reason, I think, that they haven't been able to figure this conundrum out.
Well, look, let me just pause there for a second, which is on this question of Muslims, because in the interview, in the profile, you spoke to a gentleman who is the head of the committee which administers the Gyanvapi Mosque. This is another kind of Islamic landmark in Uttar Pradesh, which the BJP, many of its supporters, believe rightfully belongs to the Hindu community. It's one of the many temples, including Mathura and other places, that get talked about as kind of what comes next after Babri Masjid. This gentleman told you, and I'm just going to kind of paraphrase what he said, which is that he felt let down, by the Rahul and the Congress, and that not only have they not really effectively raised the issues of the Gyanvapi Mosque, they haven't really adequately highlighted the anxiety that Muslims feel. And so I guess, just to kind of circle back to what we were just talking about, I mean, is there a sense in which, yes, they don't want to do something that might erode their Muslim, quote unquote, vote bank, but in fact, Muslim voters have already left them or in the process of leaving them because they feel that they haven't been their effective representatives.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of points here. I mean, and Uttar Pradesh again makes a perfect sort of test case to talk about these things. Uttar Pradesh, as with many other states in India, was one of the places where the Congress for a long time felt it could at least count on the votes of the Muslims. If no one else, they were a strong, sort of sturdy vote bank in the state. That hasn't been true for close to 40 years, maybe more. Ever since, for example, the Samajwadi Party came in and started attracting Muslim voters itself, the Congress hasn't been able to rely on this population with the same kind of confidence. But then the second thing also is this question we were talking about earlier, which is in its own, the Congress feels, I think, trapped in and unsure of how to figure out how to be a liberal party today. And again, to come back to Uttar Pradesh, the perfect example of this is what happened with the Ayodhya Mosque. So when the big inauguration happened in January, the Congress didn't send any representatives to the function, which I thought was actually a pretty bold move. But then I kept watching for what Rahul would say about Ayodhya in the state, and the only times he brought up the inauguration was to speak to members of lower castes in his audience to say, did you see anybody from your community at the inauguration? No, it was all sort of wealthy upper caste Brahmins. There were no leaders of your community who were even invited. So already here, he has sort of implicitly accepted the premise of the inauguration itself. He has not questioned the way in which the temple came up or the way in which the mosque fell. He has sort of accepted this premise of the inauguration as a high stature event. And the only questions he had about it was sort of the representative nature of the ceremony over there. And I felt this was, again, I was trying to think to myself about why he would do that. And now, obviously, there are many reasons. I mean, one is that he feels unable to push back sufficiently on the Hindu nationalist narrative that is embedded in the inauguration. The other is that maybe he doesn't feel like he has the locus standi to do this. If his father was the one who, for example, allowed was it locks to be opened or worship to begin in the basement of the Babri Masjid. So so the Congress's own sort of past complicity in some of this is a burden he can't shed. And this comes back to the ultimate sort of trap for Rahul himself personally is that he is of the family. With any other party, I think it's easier to disavow things that have happened in previous generations. It's much harder when the things that have happened because your grandmother or your father or your mother have carried those things out. And so he feels trapped and the Congress feels trapped. And as a result of all of this, he is just unable to take a stand on anti-Muslim rhetoric, on pro-Hindutva rhetoric, which is why, in the final instance, somebody like Nomani feels let down. I mean, Nomani said, he has sympathy for Rahul himself as a person, but he feels let down not only by the Congress, but by many other parties as well, who have just failed to stand up adequately for the Muslims of India.
All right, so this is maybe a natural place to kind of bring this conversation to a close because you've just brought us to this question of Rahul and his political base and his family's political base. So back in 2009, you traveled to Amethi, which was Rahul's former constituency in Uttar Pradesh. He lost the elections there in 2019 to the BJP Smriti Irani, who subsequently became a minister. This time around, Gandhi's chosen to run not from his pocket borough, but from the nearby constituency of Raebareli, which has long been held by his mother, Sonia Gandhi. What was the vibe like in Amethi when you were there? I mean, was there a kind of popular outcry that you could sense that Rahul should contest from his one-time bastion? I mean, there certainly was a lot of chatter in the political class amongst the kind of pundits that, look, actually, Smriti Irani might be vulnerable there. This would make a lot of sense. Obviously, Rahul had a different calculation. Tell us a little bit about what you saw from the ground.
I mean, I think obviously when you talk to people with the Congress party on the ground, they are going to they are going to make it seem as if there's a big popular outcry, a big sort of an appeal for Rahul to come back to contest from Amethi. I don't know if that was actually the case. From the instance of the one rally that I went to that he held, it didn't seem like that he drew very much traction at all. And I couldn't figure out, I couldn't figure out whether Rahul's reluctance to take on Smriti Irani was sort of political acumen, that he felt that he would still lose, or whether it was just a case of kind of almost personal dudgeon, that he felt let down in 2019 by the voters and so decided he wanted to spurn them again. I hope it wasn't the case. I mean, that's not how a politician should make decisions. And conversely, obviously, I think the reason that he decided to stand from Raebareli in addition to Wayanad is that I think that he thinks that constituency is still safe. It was with Sonia Gandhi until recently. The rally there was much bigger than the one at Amethi. It was much better attended, and there was a certain energy over there that I didn't feel at all in Amethi. But it's sort of so hard to gauge from these rallies in particular because, as you know, most of these people are trucked there and trucked back. They're kind of rallied there by Congress workers, and so it isn't really an index of political popularity. But I do think he felt, perhaps rightly, that Raebareli was a much safer seat, and maybe even felt that it had to somehow stay in the Congress rather than losing all of Uttar Pradesh entirely. That would be sort of the final nail in the coffin for the party in the state.
My guest on the show this week is the journalist Samanth Subramanian. His recent profile of Rahul Gandhi appears in the New York Times Magazine. It's titled "Time is Running Out for Rahul Gandhi's Vision for India." In addition to his wonderful books, he's a longtime magazine journalist who's written for The Guardian, The New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, Wired, Harper's. I also want to just make a small plug for his newsletter, which is called Multi-Storied, which is not just a place where he talks about his recent publications, but also his work in progress, which is always fun to read. Samanth, thanks so much for taking the time, especially on a bank holiday in the UK. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Mira Varghese is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.